Was Yahweh, the God of Israel, really defeated by another god? Have you heard this story? In 2 Kings 3, the story ends with Israel retreating in shame, and skeptics whisper that Chemosh, the god of Moab, was victorious that day. But if that were true, it would shake the very heart of faith. Could the scriptures themselves be admitting that Yahweh once lost? Today we will see why this passage has unsettled generations. The answer is stranger, darker, and holier than you were ever told. So what really happened when Yahweh's Israelites faced the Moab people who worshipped the god Chemosh? Let's step into the spiritually infused battlefield. The banners of 3 armies rose against the dawn, dust curling under the tramp of feet and hooves. Israel under Joram, Judah under Jehoshaphat, and Edom beside them marched east against Moab. The sun lit their shields like fire, the air thick with the smell of sweat and iron. At their head was confidence, because Elisha had spoken, Yahweh would give them victory. Rivers would fill without rain, the valley would drink, and Moab's defences would fall. Yet across those walls another god was invoked. Moab did not march under silence. They worshipped Chemosh, their god of war and fire, feared for demanding children's blood. Every shrine in Moab carried his name. Every soldier's cry rose to him. This was not only a battle of nations, but a clash between gods, Yahweh against Chemosh. At first, it seemed certain who held power. Yahweh gives Israel a vision of victory, Moab's cities laid waste, and their strongholds torn down. The armies believe him, and when morning comes, the prophecy unfolds. Water floods the valley, glinting red in the sunrise, so that Moab's sentries mistake it for blood. Certain their enemies have slaughtered each other, they rush in unprepared and are struck down. Israel gains the upper hand, pressing deep into Moab's heartland. It looks as though Yahweh has fulfilled his word. Elisha's prophecy looked sealed, but then the story turns. When Israel's army closed around Kir-Hareseth, Mesha, king of Moab, took the unthinkable step. Imagine being an Israelite soldier, watching smoke rise from the walls, certain the siege would end in triumph. Then you hear a cry from the battlements. Mesha appears, not with sword or shield, but with his firstborn son, the heir to his throne. Before the eyes of both armies, he raises the boy high, and lays him on the fire as a gift to Chemosh, the god he believed could rescue him when no army could. The silence that followed was heavier than the clash of steel. Scripture records it with a single line. Then great wrath came against Israel, so they withdrew and returned to their own land. How could this be? Yahweh's prophet had promised victory. The city was breaking. Yet at the moment of Moab's greatest desperation, Israel turned back in defeat. For the Moabites, this was Chemosh answering his worshipper. For Israel, it was a moment of unbearable shame, raising a terrible question. Had their God been beaten? This is where the mystery begins. We were never meant to see Israel retreat under the shadow of another god. What do you think? Did Yahweh lose to another god that day? But before we continue, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments, have you ever heard about this story? This single verse stands like an open wound in scripture, sparking centuries of debate. Could the Bible itself be admitting that Yahweh was once outmatched? Or is the truth buried deeper beneath the smoke of sacrifice and the wrath that followed? To find the answer, we must press further into the mystery, into the inscriptions and echoes that surround this battle, and discover whether Chemosh truly rose in power, or whether something more terrifying was at work. The smoke over Moab's walls lingered in memory, but centuries later, another voice rises from stone to claim what happened that day. In 1868, a black basalt monument was unearthed in Dibon, ancient Moab. Its surface was inscribed with lines carved by King Mesha himself. Scholars call it the Mesha Stele, one of the oldest inscriptions outside the Bible. When local Bedouin tribes first uncovered it, European scholars rushed to see it, and tensions grew so high that the stone was shattered in the conflict, its fragments scattered before being painstakingly reassembled decades later. On it, Mesha boasts of his revolt, and his words cut deep. Chemosh gave me victory over Israel. For skeptics, this stone feels like confirmation. The Bible ends the story with Israel retreating under wrath, and here is Mesha saying, Chemosh, not Yahweh, decided the outcome. Could the Bible itself be admitting what Moab proclaimed, that Chemosh defeated the God of Israel? This is not an easy question. Israel's prophets were Yahweh's scribes. Would they really preserve a record that left Chemosh triumphant? And yet the text does not silence the scene, it preserves it as if daring us to wrestle with its meaning. You can picture the skeptic's case, one source from Israel, one from Moab, both telling the same story of defeat. To the outsider, it looks like Chemosh won. But pause here. Archaeology brings us the stele, but even its survival tells a story. Its surface was cracked in antiquity, broken into fragments, and buried. Dust and stone muffled its voice until explorers pieced it together again. Was this voice of Chemosh hidden in the ground until our own day, so that we would ask the question afresh? Notice too how Mesha frames himself. He is not simply reporting history, he is boasting. He carved that victory into basalt so future generations would remember his God's power. Yet the very act of boasting makes us ask, if Chemosh had truly bested Yahweh, why did later Moabite power collapse so quickly into silence? We never hear Chemosh's name again in the sweep of empires, but we do hear Yahweh's, carried from exiles to synagogues to churches. Still, the question remains, unshaken. Did Israel's God lose on that day? If you were holding that stone, running your hands across the grooves of Mesha's letters, would you feel you were touching proof of Chemosh's power? Or would you sense something else, that a deeper hand was shaping even the inscriptions of kings? The text in 2 Kings leaves us uneasy, and the stele sharpens the unease. 2 accounts, 1 moment, 2 gods claimed. Whose wrath really drove Israel back? Skeptics stop here and say Chemosh had his victory, Yahweh was defeated, and Israel's faith survived by rewriting failure as theology. But the biblical record resists that conclusion. The words great wrath hang unresolved, never naming Chemosh. Instead, they invite us to look deeper into the language itself, because in Hebrew, wrath is not random. It is a word that almost always belongs to Yahweh. And if that is true, then the question is not whether Chemosh triumphed, but why Yahweh's wrath would fall upon his own people. But this part is only the beginning. For to see whose anger filled the battlefield, we must listen not to Mesha's stone, but to the sacred language of Israel's scrolls, where wrath carries a meaning that no Moabite monument could imagine. In Hebrew, great wrath was never vague. It always meant Yahweh's anger, which means the author is saying something radical. The wrath that broke Israel that day came not from Chemosh, but from Yahweh himself. Do you see how dangerous that is? The enemy Israel feared was never Moab's God, but their own covenant Lord. That is why the words sting. They were not abandoned to Chemosh. They were judged by Yahweh. So why did Yahweh's wrath fall at Mesha's sacrifice? What line had Israel crossed that turned his anger against his own armies? The answer is hidden deeper in the story, where the pattern of Exodus itself has been turned inside out. You remember the battle scene in Moab's wilderness, where water suddenly filled the dry valley. Israel drank, but their enemies saw only red in the dawn light, mistaking it for blood. What followed was confusion and slaughter. At first glance, this reads like a miracle in Israel's favour, but listen closely. These are Exodus motifs retold with a twist. Water given in the desert recalls the rock Moses struck at Horeb. Water mistaken for blood recalls the Nile turning crimson before Pharaoh. Soon after comes the death of a firstborn son, only this time it is Mesha's heir on the wall. These echoes are not coincidence. The writer frames the campaign as a dark parody of Israel's own deliverance story, as if to say, when Yahweh's people walk in disobedience, they do not relive Egypt's escape. they become Egypt itself. Think of it. Israel, once the slave crying for freedom, now mirrors the oppressor whose stubbornness brought plagues. Does this not chill you? The parallels unfold relentlessly. The wilderness gift of water becomes a snare. The vision of blood leads not to Egypt's defeat, but Israel's confusion. The death of the firstborn no longer frees a nation, it condemns one. This is why the Deuteronomistic historian, shaping the record centuries later, lets the Exodus patterns bleed through. He wants us to see Israel's kings acting as pharaohs, and Israel's armies trapped in an inverted story of salvation. And here is where the dread deepens, because if Israel has become Egypt, then Yahweh will treat them as he once treated Egypt. The wrath does not come from Chemosh, for Chemosh never parted seas or rained manna. The wrath comes from the covenant God himself, who warned through Moses that if his people abandoned his law, they would suffer Egypt's fate. What do you think? If the story turns Israel into Egypt, then what chance did they ever have standing in Moab's shadow? This is why the account feels so heavy. It is not just a military campaign, it is scripture pulling Israel's history inside out, showing us what happens when chosen people forget their calling. If the prophet Elisha spoke the word of Yahweh promising victory, why did that prophecy fail? Elisha's prophecy promised victory, yet the campaign ended in dread. Was the prophet wrong, or did Israel misunderstand what God had promised? In the ancient world, prophecy was never a mechanical prediction, but a living word bound to covenant faithfulness. Was the prophet wrong, or was Israel blind to what had truly been promised? This is the heart of the tension. Elisha's words in 2 Kings 3 promised that God would give Moab into their hand, but prophecy in the ancient world was rarely simple prediction. Often it was a window into God's intention, fulfilled only as long as the people walked in covenant faithfulness. In 1 Kings 22, another prophet, Micaiah, revealed a heavenly vision where God allowed Ahab to be deceived by false assurances of victory, testing whether the king would listen to truth or flattery. Was the same dynamic at work here? Did Joram and his allies hear Elisha's prophecy, then assume it meant total conquest, when God had only promised partial deliverance? Some scribes hesitated over this passage, as though afraid of what it suggested. But when we read carefully, we notice that the prophecy was fulfilled in part. The land was struck, the Moabites reeled, the cities fell. Yet Israel overreached. They demanded more than God had given. Their disobedience opened the door for wrath, turning triumph into retreat. And so the question shifts. Was it ever about Elisha at all? Or was the real issue Israel's inability to recognize the limits God himself had set? Think of this moment. The armies march home, the words of Elisha still ringing in their ears, no longer triumphant, but haunted. Would you have doubted the prophet if you stood among them? This is where the mystery sharpens. Because if Israel's downfall was not the collapse of prophecy, but the collapse of covenant, then the story becomes less about whether Chemosh overpowered Yahweh, and more about whether Israel trusted Yahweh at all. This leads us directly into the next question. What power, if any, did Mesha's sacrifice truly hold? Every soldier watching knew exactly what he was doing. This was no random outburst. It was deliberate sacrifice to Chemosh. To the Moabites it proved Chemosh had risen in triumph, but the writer's silence makes it clear that the real power at work was Yahweh's judgment. Was it sorcery, or something deeper? In the cultures around Israel, the life of the firstborn son was seen as bound to the father. The heir carried the guilt of the dynasty. When treaties were broken, when oaths to gods were violated, the firstborn could be offered as substitute, paying the penalty with his life. Micah 6:7, written centuries later, captures this mindset in Israel's own anguished voice. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Could this be what Mesha was doing? Not summoning Chemosh to strike, but repaying the God he had offended by breaking covenant? After all, the Moabite Stone itself, the Mesha stele, boasts of the king's revolt against Israel as service to Chemosh. If rebellion was framed as holy duty, then failure was guilt, and guilt demanded blood. Imagine the silence as they watched. Deuteronomy 12 had banned child sacrifice with absolute clarity, calling it an abomination, a crime against Yahweh. Yet now, Israel stood across from Moab's walls, witnessing such a sacrifice, and they did not turn away. They lingered. They remained complicit as the fire rose, as Chemosh was invoked, as covenant was mocked. And then the text tells us, great wrath fell upon Israel, and they withdrew. Whose wrath? If it was Chemosh's, then the story proclaims Yahweh defeated, his people helpless before Moab's God. But if it was Yahweh's, then the sacrifice was not sorcery that worked, but a test Israel failed by tolerating what he abhorred. The scene is turned upside down. The sacrifice did not prove Chemosh's power, but exposed Israel's compromise before Yahweh's holiness. That is why the verse feels hauntingly abrupt, as though the writer was almost afraid to linger on the shame. Would you have stood still on that battlefield, watching the flames rise? The true horror was not Chemosh's triumph, but Yahweh's wrath turning against his own people. So what did the Israelites do to deserve the wrath of Yahweh? That sacrifice became the turning point. From that moment the story shifts from battle to covenant, because the wrath that fell was Yahweh's own. His holiness would not let his people stand victorious while they tolerated a child's blood on the wall. This is where the investigation narrows to a single question. Why would Yahweh turn his face against his own armies? The answer lies in covenant law. Deuteronomy warned that if Israel ever walked in the ways of the nations, shedding blood or bowing to foreign gods, Yahweh's anger would burn against them, and he would hand them over to their enemies. The historian who wrote Kings would have known these words, and every Israelite who first heard the story would have felt the sting of recognition. They had become the very thing they once hated. Think of it. Yahweh's armies stood before Moab and watched a child's life poured out on the stones, and none turned away, none cried out. The covenant was clear. Such sacrifices were an abomination. By their silence they shared in the guilt, and so the wrath fell. Israel marched under Yahweh's name, only to find he himself had become their adversary, the consuming fire called Great Wrath. This is a moment meant to unsettle us, because it shows that belonging to Yahweh is no guarantee of safety if his holiness is mocked. You can feel the weight of it. Soldiers who had tasted victory suddenly stricken with dread, kings who thought they had triumphed, fleeing back across the Jordan with empty hands. Would you still call this Chemosh's victory? No, it was Yahweh, refusing to let his name be mocked. The Yahweh versus Chemosh tension dissolves here into something greater, because the true clash is not between rival gods, but between Yahweh's holiness and human disobedience. Israel's downfall proves the pattern we see again and again in Scripture. When God's people imitate the nations, he withdraws his hand, and judgment comes. The prophets later cried that same warning, "Do not presume on the covenant. Do not imagine Yahweh can be used like a talisman." This story burns that truth into memory. Israel was not overpowered, they were exposed. The horror of that day was not that Yahweh lost to Chemosh, but that his own people gave him reason to turn his face away. Israel had seen his wonders, heard his covenant, and still they stood before a sacrifice that should have sickened them and did nothing. That silence carried more weight than Moab's cry. The wrath that followed was not the triumph of a rival god, but the consequence of covenant broken and holiness ignored. And that is where the story leaves us, not with a god defeated, but with Yahweh revealed as the one power no nation, no idol, no rebellion can withstand. The lesson is sobering, yet it is also hope, because if the downfall came through unfaithfulness, then the way back is still open through faith. The holy God who judges is the same God who restores. And so we are left with the same choice Israel faced. Will we honour his covenant or harden our hearts? Think on it. What does this story tell you about Yahweh's holiness and about the cost of standing in his presence? If this journey stirred something in you, do not let it vanish in the noise. There are more whispers hidden in Scripture's pages, waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us. Subscribe, listen closer, and keep walking this narrow road between thunder and silence. I look forward to seeing you again.